The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
There are television shows that entertain, and then there are television shows that permanently alter the landscape of what comedy can be. Fawlty Towers belongs firmly in the second category. 12 episodes. Just 12. That is all it took for John Cleese and his co-writer Connie Booth to produce what many critics, scholars, and devoted fans still regard as the single greatest sitcom ever committed to film. The British Film Institute agreed, naming it the best British television series of all time in the year 2000. And yet, for all its celebrated genius, Fawlty Towers carries a shadow. One episode in particular, one scene in particular, that set off a chain reaction of controversy so explosive it nearly erased the show from public memory altogether. To understand how that moment came to exist, you have to go back to where everything began. Not in a writer's room, not in a BBC boardroom, but in a seaside hotel in Torquay, Devon, sometime around 1970, when a group of extraordinarily funny men arrived to film Monty Python's Flying Circus and stumbled into what can only be described as a masterclass in catastrophic hospitality. The Gleneagles Hotel was, by most accounts, a perfectly ordinary establishment on the surface. What made it extraordinary was its manager, a man named Donald Sinclair. Sinclair was not merely rude. He was rude with a kind of theatrical commitment that bordered on performance art. He treated paying guests as personal inconveniences, responded to complaints with open contempt, and appeared to operate according to an internal logic that no outside observer could hope to decode. When Eric Idle, one of the Python troupe, left his briefcase briefly unattended in the hotel lobby, Sinclair did not ask whose it was. He did not post a notice at the front desk. He picked it up and threw it over a garden wall, apparently convinced it contained a bomb. When Terry Gilliam used his knife and fork in a manner Sinclair deemed incorrect, Sinclair marched over and corrected him, as though improper utensil technique were a matter of public safety. The rest of the Python team fled the hotel within days. John Cleese stayed the entire week. He was transfixed. Here was a human being so magnificently wrong for his profession, so utterly committed to his own peculiar worldview, that Cleese could not look away. He took mental notes. He studied the man's rhythms, his tics, the way his indignation would swell and then explode in completely misdirected directions. Years later, filtered through Cleese's comic sensibility and refined by Booth's sharp structural instincts, Donald Sinclair became Basil Fawlty, and Basil Fawlty became immortal. When Fawlty Towers first aired on the BBC in September 1975, the critical response was not what history would later suggest. Several reviewers found it baffling, too frenetic, too uncomfortable. One critic famously described it as a disaster, which, in retrospect, is one of the great misfires of television criticism. What those early detractors failed to grasp was that the discomfort was the entire point. The show was not asking you to sit back and observe chaos from a safe distance. It was dragging you inside the chaos, making you complicit in Basil's mounting catastrophes, forcing you to laugh even as you winced. The genius of the format rested on a deceptively simple foundation. Each episode began with some small, manageable problem, a delivery mix-up, an unexpected guest, a minor misunderstanding, and then systematically escalated that problem through a series of increasingly desperate interventions until the whole thing collapsed in spectacular ruin. It was classical farce, executed with the precision of a Swiss watch and the energy of a runaway train. At the center of everything was Basil himself. John Cleese's portrayal was not simply funny. It was a psychologically coherent portrait of a deeply insecure man whose towering sense of his own refinement was in perpetual, catastrophic conflict with the reality of his circumstances. Basil wanted to run a sophisticated establishment catering to upper-class clientele. Instead, he was trapped in a modest hotel in Torquay, managing a staff he couldn't control, a wife he feared, and a clientele that never lived up to his snobbish fantasies. Every episode was, at its core, a story about the violence that reality does to self-delusion. Prunella Scales as Sybil Fawlty provided the perfect counterweight, a woman of absolute authority and zero patience, capable of deflating Basil's grandest pretensions with a single syllable. Connie Booth's Polly was the audience's surrogate, the only genuinely competent person in the building, watching the disasters unfold with weary resignation. And then there was Andrew Sachs as Manuel, the Spanish waiter whose cheerful incomprehension of the English language transformed every misunderstanding into a full-scale emergency. Manuel was the show's moral heart, endlessly enthusiastic, endlessly abused, endlessly surviving. Together, these four people created something that felt less like a television program and more like a living organism, a closed ecosystem of dysfunction that somehow generated new comic life in every episode. Season 1 came and went. The BBC, uncertain about the show's commercial prospects, had nearly canceled it after 6 episodes, only relenting when reruns began drawing significantly larger audiences. By 1979, for years after the first broadcast, a second series was commissioned and produced. It was during this second series that Fawlty Towers produced the episode that would define its legacy, divide its audience, and ultimately contribute to its disappearance from certain platforms and schedules for years to come. The episode was called The Germans. In terms of pure comic construction, it remains a masterpiece. The setup involves Basil nursing a head injury, sustained from a moose head falling on him, a detail so perfectly, absurdly Basil that it requires no further explanation. With a concussion clouding his already unreliable judgment, Basil must navigate the arrival of a group of German tourists. Aware of his own tendency to say the wrong thing, he issues a firm instruction to his STA. FF. Under no circumstances are they to mention the war. What follows is one of the most celebrated comic sequences in British television history. Basil, desperately trying to suppress his own worst impulses, cannot stop himself. Every attempt to be a gracious host collapses into another World War II reference. The more he fights the impulse, the more catastrophically it overwhelms him, until he is marching through the hotel lobby in an exaggerated goose-step, performing a grotesque impression of Adolf Hitler to the horrified bewilderment of his German guests. For many viewers, then and now, the scene is a brilliant piece of satirical comedy. The target of the humor is not Germany, not Germans, not even the war itself. The target is Basil, his ignorance, his complete lack of self-awareness, his inability to behave in even the most basic civilized manner. The joke is not that the Germans are ridiculous. The joke is that Basil is ridiculous, that he is so consumed by his own cultural obsessions that he cannot function in the presence of people he has arbitrarily decided to be nervous around. The comedy comes from watching a man determinedly dig his own grave, while being fully convinced he is doing something entirely different. Cleese himself was unequivocal about the intent. In numerous interviews over the years, he insisted that The Germans was never a joke about Germany. It was a joke about the British, specifically, about the peculiar British habit, common in the post-war decades, of defining their own national identity almost entirely in relation to World War II. Basil's frantic obsession with the war is not a reflection of any genuine hostility. It is the behavior of a man whose cultural frame of reference is so limited and so dated that he simply cannot see past it. The Germans in the episode are portrayed with complete dignity. They are polite, patient, and entirely reasonable. They are not the butt of the joke. Basil is. But comedy, as anyone who has spent time studying it knows, is one of the most contextually dependent art forms in human culture. What reads as brilliant satire in one room can land as cruel mockery in another. And The Germans, for all the sophistication of its comic intent, contained imagery and references that some viewers found deeply painful regardless of the satirical framing. For people who had lived through the war, or whose families had survived, or not survived, the worst of it, watching a comedy sketch built around Hitler impressions and goose-step marches, was not an abstract exercise in satirical analysis. It was a confrontation with real historical trauma, packaged as entertainment. The complaint was not that the joke was aimed at the wrong person. The complaint was that some subjects carry a weight that comedy struggles to bear, no matter how carefully it is constructed. Letters flooded the BBC. Critics accused the show of trivializing history. A small but vocal group demanded the episode be permanently withdrawn. BBC executives engaged in extended internal debate about whether to keep the episode in circulation or quietly retire it. In the end, it remained, but the controversy it generated contributed to a broader atmosphere of wariness around the show, a sense that Fawlty Towers was a program that required constant managing and defending. When the streaming era arrived and old television began circulating on global platforms, the Germans encountered a new generation of critics armed with new standards. Several platforms removed the episode entirely. Others edited specific scenes. The debate that had begun in 1979 reignited with fresh energy in a media landscape where a clip from a 40-year-old sitcom could go viral overnight and be judged by an audience with no context for its original broadcast environment. This is where the show's disappearance, partial, inconsistent, but real, began. It was not a single dramatic moment. There was no press conference, no formal announcement. It was the slow, quiet withdrawal of a program from certain schedules, certain platforms, certain discussions, as broadcasters and streaming services made individual decisions about what to do with material that had become genuinely contested. The removal of the Germans, or portions of it, was not an isolated event. It was part of a much larger cultural reckoning that swept through the archives of British and American television in the early decades of the 21st century. Classic comedies were being reevaluated, and many of them were found to contain material that modern standards of cultural sensitivity could not accommodate without qualification. Some of this reevaluation was straightforward and necessary. There are moments in older television that reflect attitudes toward race, gender, disability, and sexuality that were never acceptable, even if they were normalized within the broadcast culture of their time. Flagging or contextualizing such material is a reasonable response to changing social standards. But the case of Fawlty Towers raised a more complicated question. Here was a show whose entire comic premise was the exposure and mockery of exactly the kind of bigotry, snobbery, and cultural ignorance that it was accused of promoting. Basil Fawlty is not a hero. He is not a role model. He is not someone the audience is invited to admire. He is a cautionary figure, a portrait of everything that is small, petty, and ridiculous about a certain strain of English pomposity. The joke is always on him. Removing or editing episodes of Fawlty Towers on the grounds that its content is offensive requires a reading of the show that is precisely opposite to what the show is actually doing. It punishes satire for depicting the thing it is satirizing. It is the equivalent of banning a novel about racism because the novel contains racist characters. The presence of offensive behavior in the text is not an endorsement of offensive behavior. It is the raw material from which the critique is constructed. John Cleese, never a man who has struggled to express an opinion, made this argument loudly and repeatedly. He was furious about the edits, furious about the removals, and furious about what he saw as a fundamental misreading of his work. He pointed out, correctly, that every character in Fawlty Towers who behaves badly is made to suffer for it, that the show's moral architecture is one in which arrogance, ignorance, and cruelty are always punished, always exposed, always made to look ridiculous. The comedy is not celebrating these qualities. It is demolishing them. The controversy around the Germans has never fully resolved itself. It has simply settled into a permanent state of argument, revisited every few years when someone new encounters the episode or when another platform makes another editorial decision about its circulation. The debate is, in its own way, a tribute to the show's vitality. A truly dead piece of television does not generate this much passionate disagreement. What is perhaps most remarkable about Fawlty Towers is that the controversy has not diminished its stature. If anything, it has reinforced the sense that this was a program that mattered, that it was doing something real, saying something real, and that the conversation about what it was saying is still worth having. The British Film Institute's ranking still stands. The academic study of the show continues. New generations discover it and are startled by how much of it still works, how sharp the writing remains, how precisely observed the characters are. There is something deeply instructive about the fact that a 12-episode sitcom produced between 1975 and 1979 can still provoke genuine debate in the 21st century. Most television simply fades. It entertains for a season, a decade at most, and then retreats into nostalgia, watched only by those who remember it from the first time. Fawlty Towers has not faded. It has remained a living text, one that continues to reward scrutiny and generate argument. The disappearance of the show from certain corners of the broadcasting landscape is real, but it is incomplete. For every platform that removed the Germans, another kept it. For every broadcaster that added cautionary disclaimers, another aired it without comment. The show is not gone. It is contested, which is, arguably, exactly the condition that serious comedy should aspire to occupy. There's a final question that the Fawlty Towers controversy forces us to confront, and it is one that extends far beyond this particular show. When we remove or edit comedy that makes us uncomfortable, what do we actually accomplish? Does the discomfort disappear? Or do we simply lose the opportunity to examine what was causing the discomfort in the first place? Satire has always operated in uncomfortable territory. From Jonathan Swift to Charlie Chaplin to the writers of Fawlty Towers, the satirical tradition has always required the satirist to engage directly with the ugliest aspects of human behavior, to hold them up, to exaggerate them, to make them visible and therefore available for examination and critique. This cannot be done from a safe distance. It requires contact with the material. It requires depicting the very thing it is criticizing. When Basil Fawlty marches through the hotel lobby in his goose-step impression, the joke is not that this is funny behavior. The joke is that this is appalling behavior, committed by a man who cannot see how appalling it is. The audience's laughter is not approval. It is the laughter of horrified recognition, the laughter that comes from watching someone do exactly what they promised not to do, in exactly the way you feared they would do it, while remaining entirely convinced that they are handling the situation admirably. That is sophisticated comedy. It requires the audience to hold two things in mind simultaneously: the surface absurdity and the underlying critique. Removing it does not protect anyone from the attitudes it depicts. Those attitudes exist in the world whether or not the episode airs. What the episode does is take those attitudes and make them look stupid, which is precisely what satire is supposed to do. The scene that took Fawlty Towers off the air, in whatever partial and inconsistent way that disappearance occurred, was not a failure of the show. It was a failure of the conversation around the show. A failure to engage with what the comedy was actually doing and why. The scene endures because it is extraordinary. The debate endures because the questions it raises are genuine. And Fawlty Towers itself endures because great comedy, comedy that actually means something, does not quietly check out. It books a room, causes chaos, refuses to apologize, and somehow, inexplicably, leaves everyone better for having been there.